Hello, today we will be finishing up our discussion on Chapter 6 in the third section of the memory chapter. And so here we see the organizational breakdown of our long-term memory system. So we will just start with the discussion on implicit memory and then move on to explicit memory. And so with implicit memory, this occurs even without any effort to try and remember these memories. And it's really an awareness of the recollection of a memory. And so examples of implicit memory includes our ability to tie our shoes, driving a car. So there are these behaviors that automatically occur even without us having to think about it. And so there are two types of implicit memory, which include priming and procedural memory. And priming is where we're able to think of a stimulus following being recently exposed to it. So one example of this is if we heard or read the word rabbit, and once you read that word, or if I told you the word rabbit, the concept of a rabbit is activated. So you may picture a small white furry animal. Then if I asked you to spell hare, you would be more than likely to spell the word hare using H-A-R-E rather than H-A-I-R because you were primed to think about a rabbit. Next is procedural memory. And so procedural memory is the second type of implicit memory where through the gradual learning of skills, we implicitly are able to act in that fashion. And one example is riding a bike. And so when you first start to learn how to ride the bike, you go through this different type of procedure. First, you swing your leg over the bike, then you push off the pedal and put your other foot on the pedal. And once you start actually learning how to ride a bike, maybe you were making that transition from a little kid's bike with the little extra wheels on it to actually riding a two-wheeled bike, then you go through this procedure and you gradually acquire or learn these new skills. And once you start practicing that over and over again, then it just becomes almost second nature to you. So here we've briefly talked about implicit memory, and next we'll discuss explicit and the two types of explicit memory. So explicit memory involves intentionally trying to remember things or facts or knowledge, like recalling what you did over summer vacation, incidents from a novel that you just read, facts that you studied for a test, are all examples of explicit memory. And so the two types that make up explicit memory include semantic and episodic memory. And our semantic memory is a network of associated facts and concepts that make up our general knowledge of the world. So if you correctly recall that Wilhelm Wundt developed the first laboratory solely devoted to psychology, you were using your semantic memory. Earlier, we discussed the role of the hippocampus in long-term memory storage. Researchers observed and demonstrated that children who had suffered hippocampal damage during birth, maybe because they were they had an undersupply of oxygen during when they were in the womb, they found that these children can actually still learn to read, write, and spell, develop normal vocabulary, and acquire other semantic knowledge. And so they're able to encode that information onto their long-term memory, even though they did experience this hippocampal damage or maybe an undergrowth of their hippocampal area structure within their brain. So as a result, they concluded that the hippocampus is not necessary for acquiring new information, or more specifically, acquiring new semantic memories or knowledge. So next is episodic memory. And so episodic memory is idiosyncratic, or a memory that is made up of your own individual experiences and personal background and history. So it's also involved in imagining your future. So your memory of graduating high school or your your sweet 16th birthday is personal to you and is located in your episodic memory. When we are encoding any piece of information onto our long-term memory, researchers have demonstrated that if you imagine this piece of information in some bizarre manner, then you're more likely to remember things rather than simply just trying to rehearse them. So if you need to memorize a list of words for class, pairing a word with something bizarre may help you improve that memory or encode it onto your memory system. And so one example could be going through your grocery list and matching them or pairing them, and walking through Walmart, like our one example, and imagining all the people or the interesting types of people that you see at Walmart and pairing it with that grocery list. And so next we move on to talking about memory failures in the 7 sense of memory. So Schachter, who's one of the main authors of your textbook, is well known for his work on the 7 sense of memory, which include this list of various memory failures. And sometimes our memory fails us, and there are these descriptions of each of these memory failures in the following slides. So the first one that we'll talk about is transience. And transience occurs after the memory is encoded, but before it's retrieved. So it's information that is lost while being stored. And so one way of thinking about transience is with short-term storage of our memories. So when you quit rehearsing that definition of a term that you're supposed to know for the exam, it simply goes away. And there are two distinct ways of interfering with information that is being stored, which include proactive and retroactive interference. An example of proactive interference is if you switch from a PC computer to a Mac computer. It will take you a long time to figure out how to learn to use a Mac because all of the earlier stuff you learned on the PC is interfering with you trying to learn the new way of operating a Mac. On the flip side, an example of retroactive interference would be after you learn to use a Mac really well for years and you try to go back to using a PC, you have a hard time remembering how to operate a PC because the information that you have now is interfering with that information that you had before. So here we have an example of transience, another one. So if we memorize facts for an exam, we often forget that information later. Another example is when learning new information, especially another language that's not your native language, your memory of that language dramatically decreases shortly after you quit rehearsing or practicing it. So this would be like practicing it for the exam or while you're in class and practicing it with friends and maybe native or fluent speakers of that language. So gradually what we see, as on this graph, as time passes, we lose more and more information more slowly. So at first we have a dramatic decrease in the information that we lose, but over time we start to slowly lose more and more. So what we see with transience is that it actually has an adaptive function for us, because if we're not using that information, then we lose it. Because what we see is that it's not important for our survival or even for the task at hand. So it's not needed. So it just drops out of our memory essentially. Okay, so the second memory failure is absent-mindedness. So we all have experienced absent-mindedness when we're sitting in class or talking with our friend who's telling a boring story or a story that they've already told you 100 times. And absent-mindedness can be caused by a lack of attention, and which may be a result of being distracted. And so this may be due to thinking about what you're going to do in the future. And so thinking about what you're going to make for dinner, or remembering that you forgot to do your homework for your college algebra class, this interferes with your attention. And so these type of memories for remembering to do things in the future is called prospective memory. So the third type of memory failure that we see is blocking. And blocking is basically a temporary retrieval failure. It doesn't happen as often as other memory failures for most of us, but it what we do see is that it's worse for names and places. And with this, it happens more often when you get older. And so blocking is also known as the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where you're trying to remember that one actress from that one movie, but you just can't quite get it out, and that's blocking. The fourth memory failure is memory misattribution, and this is where we incorrectly identify a memory with the wrong source. So interestingly, misattributions are the primary source of eyewitness misidentifications. So witnesses identifying the perpetrator in a police lineup may incorrectly identify the perpetrator. So I saw that one individual robbing the store and pointing the gun at my face. As a result, more often than not, eyewitness testimonies are less reliable. And so I think that this memory failure, or this type of memory failure, more exactly or specifically, is very interesting because memory attribution deals with you incorrectly recalling sources of information. So when you can't remember who told you that piece of gossip or where you heard it, that may be a type of source memory. Destination memory is where you have that surge of fear because you forgot maybe who you told a secret to, and false recognition that we've all experienced before. We also know this as deja vu, having that feeling that you've been in the situation in a specific location and with people that are around you. And interestingly, when we have this deja vu experience, some parts of our brain associated with memory are activated, like our hippocampus, as though we're truly recognizing the situation as something that we've been through before. Okay, and so here we have the memory failure of suggestibility, which is a tendency to incorporate misleading information from outside sources into our memory. And so I often think of children on the witness stand in a trial, and the power of persuasion, and adults suggesting to children that such and such happened. Children start to incorporate this into their memory. And importantly, this not only happens to children, but to adults as well. So Loftus, or Elizabeth Loftus, a well-known researcher on memory, has demonstrated the ability to implant false memories. So the question that is begged to be answered is, why do we have these false memories, or why are we even vulnerable to these false memories? So what we find is that we don't store all the details of our experiences in memory, so this makes us vulnerable to accept suggestions about what might have happened or should have happened, which we'll get into more detail in the social psychology chapter. In addition to that, visual imagery plays an important role in constructing false memories and lends itself to suggestibility. The sixth memory failure is bias. And so one particular bias that is fun to talk about is our tendency as humans to act in an egocentric, biased kind of way. So this is where, depending on the situation, we may unintentionally report inaccurate representations of our past. And so, for example, if you fit in with the right group, quote unquote, here at college, when you talk with those people in that group, you may only talk about the times when you were considered cool back in high school and neglect to talk about being president for the chess club all 4 years throughout high school. Another example of egocentric bias that has been demonstrated in research is when asked about high school grades. Studies have found that college students are accurate when reporting their A's and inaccurate when reporting lower grades. So we conveniently forget about the bad and emphasize the good. And so this is just a human error or a human bias that everyone shares. So memory biases are unique and can be tied to actually the field of clinical psychology by discussing mood and anxiety disorders. So often when we speak with clients and talk about their past, depending on the severity of their depressive or anxious symptoms, the individual reports that they've always had these depressive and anxious symptoms, so they never felt good about themselves or only remember bad memories when they were depressed and how people have treated them badly. And so I'm not saying everyone experiences this, but often we see people that are having these depressive or anxious symptoms may express this type of attitude or past experience. And so we may even do that to some extent, even if we don't have those symptoms. So have you ever experienced a time where you were in a bad mood and every memory that came to mind, or even just the song on the radio, just made you in a bad mood and just made it worse? So every memory that you thought of during that time even put you even a worse mood or even more sad. So this is related to that change bias, or even more so, more broadly, to just the bias of our memory failures. So lastly, what we discuss is the last memory failure, which is persistence. And this is where we do not forget a memory, but the memory is intrusive and unrelenting. So memory persistence frequently occurs with disturbing or traumatic incidents, and these emotional experiences seem to focus our attention on the central features of an event and strengthen that memory. So as such, our amygdala, the emotional processing structure, is heavily associated with this process. So persistence can be also explained by having a flashbulb memory, where you almost have a photographic memory of that emotional and disturbing event. So this particular memory failure is highly associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, as these individuals often experience flashbacks of that particular trauma or traumas. So an example of this includes that we can see across different generations even, as where we remember particularly emotional events such as when JFK was shot, the Columbine shooting, September 11th, as we see on the slide, or even the recent devastation of the Moore tornadoes here in Oklahoma. And so these type of memories are partially attributable to the high level of emotional arousal elicited by the event. So sadness, anger, guilt, all of these emotions that may go along with the trauma, and partially attributable to the fact that we tend to talk and think a lot about these experiences with friends and family, and so they just it's almost a rehearsal where we keep those in mind, these events in mind. So why do we even have these types of memory failures? What do they serve? What adaptive value do they have? So as we discussed earlier, they help to clear information that's not needed for survival and get rid of information that we do not need to pay attention to. They keep us happy, thinking that I was always a good student who got A's. I've always been a nice person to everyone I meet, even though when we really think about that, is that really true that we were nice to everyone that we met? Which it may or may not be true. And this helps us, what we also see with these memory failures, particularly persistence, is that it helps us to be prepared for future events that might occur. So now what we see after the Moore tornadoes is that more and more families and schools have bought storm shelters underground in case another major tornado hits the area. And so those are types of or reasons why we see memory failures being more adaptive for us. And so that really wraps up the 6th chapter and talking about our memory.